If you glance at a modern world map, Britain appears small. An island nation surrounded by restless seas, its borders confined to the British Isles. But the truth is far larger, far older, and far more astonishing. Scattered across the globe, from Gibraltar guarding the mouth of the Mediterranean, to the lonely Falkland Islands deep in the South Atlantic, lie 14 overseas territories still under British rule. They are the last glowing embers of a once colossal empire, an empire so vast, so powerful, and so deeply woven into human history that people once said the sun never set upon it. Just over a century ago, the British Empire was the largest the world had ever seen. It stretched across continents and seas, covering 1/4 of the planet's landmass and ruling nearly 1/3 of humanity. Kings, merchants, soldiers, explorers, and ordinary settlers carried its banner into deserts, jungles, mountains, and oceans. And yet, at its beginning, it was nothing more than a small island kingdom, fragile, divided, and far from destined for greatness. How did a tiny nation on the edge of Europe rise to become the most far-reaching empire in history? How did a people without abundant land, resources, or manpower come to dominate the world's trade, seas, and power structures? To understand the empire's extraordinary rise, we must go back to a time before Britain was even a single unified kingdom. For centuries, the driving force within the British Isles was the Kingdom of England. With a growing economy, a disciplined army, and political ambition, England slowly extended its influence over its neighbours. Wales fell under English control, followed by parts of Ireland, though the north remained fiercely resistant. Scotland stood proud and defiant, repelling invasions and maintaining its independence through centuries of conflict. Yet even as these rivalries defined the British Isles, something much bigger was beginning to stir. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, England realized that power no longer depended solely on land or armies. It depended on the oceans. Explorers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Martin Frobisher sailed into uncharted waters, claiming distant coasts in the name of England. Most of these first claims failed to become colonies, but they planted a seed, the idea that England could expand far beyond its shores. Then came a moment that would change Britain forever. In 1585, England attempted its first colony at Roanoke Island. It vanished mysteriously, its people gone without a trace. But failure did not stop ambition. Queen Elizabeth had granted charters to new trading companies, urging them to seek wealth and territories overseas. Two companies would become legendary. The Levant Company, 1592, opening trade toward the east. The East India Company, 1600, destined to become one of the most powerful commercial forces in history. These companies were not just businesses, they were engines of empire, raising armies, minting money, seizing ports, and opening England's path into global trade. Then, in 1603, a crucial turning point arrived. Queen Elizabeth died without an heir. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the two crowns under one monarch. Though England and Scotland remained separate nations, their fates were now intertwined. Under King James, a new and systematic colonization strategy began. The British created 3 types of colonies: crown colonies ruled by the monarch through appointed governors, charter colonies governed by companies or groups of settlers with broad freedoms, proprietary colonies owned by individuals or corporations seeking profit. This structure allowed Britain to expand rapidly, planting settlements, governing trade routes, and extending influence with remarkable speed. But one early event is often forgotten, despite its massive impact on the future empire: the plantation of Ulster in Northern Ireland. Protestant settlers from England and Scotland were relocated to Irish lands, creating a model of organized colonization that Britain would later replicate in America, the Caribbean, and beyond. The leaders of this plantation would one day be the architects of Britain's expansion across the Atlantic. Throughout the 1600s, the empire grew steadily. New colonies were founded along the North American coast. Caribbean islands were seized and transformed into massively profitable sugar plantations. From New York, captured from the Dutch, to Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands, Britain was building the skeleton of a global empire. Meanwhile, British merchants expanded trading posts in Africa and Asia. The creation of the Royal African Company, 1660, opened the darkest chapter in imperial economics, the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of enslaved Africans were forcibly taken across the Atlantic, generating enormous wealth for British merchants and unimaginable suffering for those enslaved. At the same time, Scotland attempted its own overseas colonies, eager to match England's successes. But these efforts collapsed, none more disastrously than the Darien scheme of 1698. Nearly a fifth of Scotland's national wealth funded a colony in Panama. Disease, starvation, and Spanish attacks destroyed it completely. The survivors limped home in shame, and Scotland's economy was left in ruins. With its future uncertain, Scotland looked toward the expanding English Empire, not as a rival but as a lifeline. By 1707, pressures from religion, economics, and politics pushed England and Scotland into a historic union. The Acts of Union created a new state, Great Britain. With a united parliament, a unified navy, and combined resources, Britain now had the strength to expand far beyond its European rivals. Wars erupted across Europe, but Britain no longer fought for survival. It fought for dominance. Victories brought new territories in North America, the Mediterranean, and the Caribbean. The British East India Company tightened its grip on India, defeating local rulers and French forces to become the major commercial and military power in the subcontinent. By the mid-1700s, the foundations of a global empire were firmly set, but this rise was only the beginning. The century to come would transform Britain from a growing power into the most dominant empire the world had ever known. By the early 18th century, Great Britain had become something new, an island nation with the ambitions of a continent. Its navy roamed the oceans, its merchants pushed into foreign markets, and its colonies stretched across the Atlantic. But what happened next would transform Britain from a rising power into the greatest imperial force the world had ever known. The 18th century became a battlefield of global empires, Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, all clashing for wealth, trade, and territory. And wherever these rivalries ignited, Britain fought not only with armies, but with a weapon far more powerful, its ability to rule the seas. After the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714, Britain emerged with new territories, Newfoundland, Acadia, Gibraltar, Minorca, strategic anchors across North America and the Mediterranean. The victories were more than symbolic. They signaled a shift in global power. Britain was no longer defending itself, it was shaping the world. Meanwhile, across the Indian subcontinent, the British East India Company, a corporation with its own soldiers, warships, and political alliances, began acting like a nation unto itself. Its clash with the French-supported Nawab of Bengal culminated in the Battle of Plassey, 1757, a turning point that handed control of Bengal to Britain. What followed was extraordinary. Through a mixture of diplomacy, threats, commerce, and private armies, the company extended its influence across India, laying the foundation for what would become Britain's jewel in the crown. Back in Europe, Britain's rivalry with France escalated into the 7 Years' War, a conflict fought across continents. In North America, Britain captured Quebec in 1759, ending France's colonial ambitions there. By 1763, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, Britain gained New France, Florida, and several Caribbean islands, turning it into the most dominant naval and colonial power on Earth. But with unprecedented expansion came unprecedented tension. The empire operated on a brutal truth. It taxed its colonies heavily, while giving them almost no political representation. In the American colonies, frustration grew like a storm on the horizon. Between the 1760s and 1770s, the relationship between Britain and its 13 colonies deteriorated rapidly. Parliament demanded revenue from the colonies. The colonists demanded their rights as Englishmen. When their voices were ignored, rebellion erupted. In 1776, the colonies declared independence, forming the United States of America. Britain fought to keep its territory, but after 8 long years of war, it was forced to recognize American independence. The loss shocked Britain. For the first time, the empire felt vulnerable. But instead of collapsing, Britain pivoted. It shifted its focus to Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, regions rich with resources, land, and opportunity. In the late 1700s, Captain James Cook charted vast stretches of the Pacific, claiming New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia. His voyages opened the door for a new wave of colonization. After the loss of the American colonies, Britain needed somewhere to transport its convicts. Australia became that destination. In 1788, the first fleet arrived in New South Wales, beginning a new chapter of empire in the southern hemisphere. Simultaneously, British explorers moved into the North Pacific. George Vancouver and Alexander Mackenzie mapped western North America, enabling British merchants to dominate the lucrative fur trade. Bit by bit, British influence crept across continents, not only through war, but through commerce, navigation, and settlement. Then in 1803, the world changed again. Europe was shaken by the rise of a new military genius, Napoleon Bonaparte. France aimed to dominate Europe, and Britain refused to bow. A massive naval confrontation loomed, and in 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, the British Navy under Admiral Lord Nelson secured the most decisive naval victory in modern history. Nelson was killed, but his triumph ended any hope of a French invasion and cemented British naval supremacy for the next 140 years. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Britain had gained even more territory: Malta, Mauritius, Ceylon, Trinidad, Tobago, Guyana, the Cape Colony, and more. These acquisitions extended Britain's strategic reach across Africa, Asia, and the Atlantic. Yet behind this grand expansion lay a dark truth. Many Caribbean colonies depended on plantation labor built on slavery. Britain had grown enormously wealthy from the slave trade, but the rise of the Industrial Revolution shifted Britain's economy from plantations to factories. Pressure from abolitionists also grew stronger. In 1807, Britain abolished the slave trade, and in 1834, it abolished slavery itself across the empire. Still, abolition did not slow Britain's imperial appetite. Between 1815 and 1914, the empire entered what historians call the imperial century, a time when Britain became the world's banker, shipbuilder, merchant, and policeman. In Asia, it founded Singapore in 1819. It seized Hong Kong and gained access to Chinese ports after the First Opium War in 1842. It spread across India until the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, after which the British Crown dissolved the East India Company and took direct control, transforming India into the empire's greatest possession. In the Middle East and Central Asia, Britain clashed with Russia in a geopolitical rivalry called the Great Game. Fearing Russian access to warm water ports, Britain fought the Crimean War, 1854-1856, defeating Russia and securing influence over the Mediterranean and Ottoman lands. It gained Cyprus as a strategic base and used Egypt as a protectorate to secure the Suez Canal, its vital route to India. In Africa, the empire expanded aggressively during the scramble for Africa. British settlers pushed into South Africa, provoking conflict with Dutch-descended Boers. The two Boer Wars eventually brought the Transvaal and Orange Free State under British control. Meanwhile, British explorers envisioned a railway stretching from Cape Town to Cairo, a symbol of imperial ambition, even if it was never fully completed. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain controlled the largest empire in human history. It had become the hub of global trade. Its navy ruled the oceans without challenge. Its merchants, missionaries, soldiers, and settlers carried its influence to every corner of the earth. The empire seemed eternal, but a storm was coming, one that would change the world forever. As the 20th century dawned, the British Empire stood at the height of its power. Its territories stretched across continents, its navy controlled every major sea route, and its wealth flowed from every corner of the globe. It was the largest empire ever built by human hands, an empire that seemed untouchable. But beneath the surface, the world was changing. New nations were rising, old empires were collapsing, and new rivalries were emerging with deadly force. Britain's first major challenge came not from its colonies, but from a powerful European competitor, Germany. Industrialized, ambitious, and building a navy to rival the Royal Navy, Germany threatened the balance Britain had controlled for centuries. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 became the spark that ignited a global inferno. The First World War began, and Britain once again looked to its empire. From Canada to Australia, from India to South Africa, soldiers crossed oceans to fight for the crown. More than 2.5 million men from across the empire served in World War I. Many never returned home. Their sacrifice helped Britain and its allies defeat Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The victory brought new territories to British control, lands in the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific, carved from the declining Ottoman and German empires. Yet victory came at a cost. Britain was victorious, but it was exhausted, wounded, and financially drained. And so the empire began to crack. 1921 marked the largest territorial extent of the British Empire, the moment it reached its absolute peak. But that same year, a symbolic loss shook the empire. Ireland, after centuries of conflict, won its independence, becoming the Irish Free State. The question spread. If Ireland could break free, who would be next? The winds of nationalism were beginning to rise in Asia, the Caribbean, and Africa. The age of unquestioned empire was ending. Then came an even greater storm, World War II. In 1939, Britain again found itself fighting for survival, this time against Nazi Germany. Once more the empire was called upon. Was Indian infantry, Canadian pilots, Australian sailors, New Zealand brigades, African soldiers, Caribbean regiments, all answered the call. Without them, the war would have been impossible to win. Britain and its allies emerged victorious in 1945, but the empire did not. The war had drained Britain's economy to its core. Debt soared, resources vanished, and global power began shifting toward two new giants, the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain could no longer sustain its enormous empire. One by one, its colonies demanded independence. India, its greatest possession, became independent in 1947, followed by Pakistan. Burma, Sri Lanka, and most of Africa followed in the 1950s and 1960s. The Caribbean and Pacific territories gained independence through the 1970s. In the span of a single generation, the world map changed forever. This great wave of decolonization became known as the Wind of Change. It was the peaceful end of 4 centuries of empire. Some former colonies chose to remain connected through an international association, the Commonwealth. Others retained the British monarch as their symbolic head of state. And many, though independent, carried with them the systems, laws, languages, and institutions Britain had left behind. But perhaps the most symbolic end of the British Empire came in 1997, when Britain handed over Hong Kong to China. Crowds gathered under the humid night sky as the Union Jack was lowered for the last time. It was a moment filled with nostalgia, pride, and quiet sadness, the final chapter of an old world, closing gently. Yet the legacy of the British Empire remains woven into the modern world. Its language, English, is now the most widely spoken on Earth. Its legal frameworks influenced courts around the world. Its parliamentary democracy shaped nations across continents. Its railways, universities, and institutions continue to endure. Modern Britain itself reflects the diversity of its former empire. Its streets alive with cultures, religions, and languages from every corner of the globe. A microcosm of the world it once ruled. The British Empire has vanished, but its imprint is everywhere. It shaped borders, ideas, economies, revolutions, and identities. It shaped the modern world, and it all began with a small island, a restless ambition, and a belief that mastery of the seas could open the door to global power. The empire grew, dominated, transformed, and eventually dissolved. But its story remains one of the most dramatic arcs in human history, an empire on which the sun never set, and a legacy that continues to rise each day across the world.